Hey there folks, so welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And today we got a new episode of The Trailing Edge, this time for July of 2018. I know I'm a little bit late here, but I got 10 records on the docket, which I didn't have enough for full reviews of each album. So let's get things started off with the newest album from Culture Delete, Suck the Internet. Okay, so this is one of two projects released on the exact same day by an online musical collective that's affiliated with a bunch of people that I've already covered in detail on this channel. Without a lot of credits, it's hard to nail down everybody attached to it, but I recognize Eric Taxon's Plunderphonics when I hear them, and Mind Over Matter shows up on a pretty strong guest verse. I was actually a little bit impressed. And I'm always a little bit skeptical when it comes to indie collective compilations like this, because you could put money on them being just all over the place. Hell, that's even true with a lot of major label compilations. And Suck the Internet, no exception, as we get everything from sample-heavy Plunderphonics to about 5 different permutations of hip-hop, from grime to SoundCloud rap. Hell, there's even a song here that I'd swear is a warped brand of indie J-pop. And for sheer experimental variety, it is kind of fascinating, and you can tell that Eric Taxon, as the mastermind, is still working some of that deconstructive edge, throwing all elements of internet culture into a blender, including his own, punch as many holes in them as possible, and see whatever mutated spawn bleeds out of it. And like with the internet, it's entirely too much and lacks a lot of coherent focus, and even that might be part of a point, it does get distracting. This project is 18 tracks and could have easily been trimmed down in order to make its point, and that's before we get close to the inelegant mixing and mastering that's pervasive all over this damn thing. Yes, I get it, it's part of the point, but it makes for a wildly jarring and inconsistent listening experience for the whole project in ways that it really shouldn't be. I also get the feeling that there are points where the satire feels a little undercooked, especially from the scant lyrics that we do get. Not that it's bad, but I've heard it all done before, even from Eric Taxon, and that's not to excuse the real duds here. I get what Memes a Maker Dance is trying to do, and it's not as blatant as I'm Not Famous was on Punk, but the slapdash presentation is arguably even less excusable here. But overall, like with everything from these artists, it's not for everybody. It's homegrown, the rough edges are very apparent, there's not quite as many hooks, and this, more than ever, is very hit and miss. But hey, if you're curious, there is enough to make it worth a listen, and you won't hear anything else like it. So, extremely light 6 out of 10. Check it out. Next up, the newest album for For My Valentine, Gravity. I have no idea why people continue to ask me to cover metalcore albums, especially from acts that were never critical darlings to begin with. And look, I re-listened to both those first 2 For My Valentine albums, and despite some really good guitar work, I was not impressed. Underwhelming vocals, incredibly dated production, and writing that never rose above mediocre. So to hear that for some ungodly reason, the band decided to hop on the atmospheric, pop, rock, quasi-nu metal sellout bandwagon, I have to ask, did even For My Valentine fans want this? Clean vocals half buried beneath flattened filters and effects, substantially less focus on the thrash-adjacent guitar lines that used to be For My Valentine's biggest selling point, which leaves the melody mostly confined to hazy background production tones or wheedling fragments, choppy rhythm sections that for some reason are being given more emphasis but have no real crunch or heft, let alone groove, and increasingly sterile kick drum fills providing that we get live drums at all. And then when you pair with painfully basic, angsty nu metal lyricism that was played out 15 years ago, and yet kind of fits even less given this production, tacked on millennial whoops, and some of the most cringy vocal overdubs sold straight like on the title track, it's no surprise, not even the fans liked this, so yeah, light 4 out of 10. I'd skip it. Next up, the newest album from Teyana Taylor, K.T.S.E.
Please wait up for me till whenever I get home. I know that you're all alone, thinking about what you gon' do. I hope that you'll see it through.
So so I will freely admit that I was intending this as a full review. But the more horror stories I heard about this project, the rush release, Teyana Taylor's own statements surrounding that it wasn't the true project that she wanted to put out, the messy back and forth with her own label that reflects about the worst possible situation for an artist still trying to establish her footing, especially with the backing she has, well, the less I wanted to give it a proper review, it just didn't seem right. And that's nothing on Teyana Taylor. I was one of the only people on YouTube to review 7 way back in 2014, and that was an underrated project, but it was also one that didn't give me a lot to say, and with K.T.S.E, well, it's even more true here, unfortunately. What gets increasingly exasperating is that this project feels oddly less like a distinctive Teyana Taylor release, and more just a vehicle for Kanye West's more soulful production that we didn't get on the rest of his mini EP rollouts for her just to sing over, not helped by the verse and vocal interjections from Kanye himself. Now granted, his odd interjections of phaser effects to the block your beats, they don't always complement the mix. The closer they come to working as the G-Funk touches that we get on Never Would Have Made It. But when you pair it with inconsistent vocal mixing as well, it's hard not to feel like Kanye's rushed production approach hit Teyana the hardest, especially with the baffling decision to include the hip house WTP at the end of the record where it does not fit at all. That said, when this record just focuses on being very relaxed, guitar and sample driven, sensual and soulful R&B, we get some solid results. Not really much I would brand as exceptional on a lyrical level or all that deep, especially on cuts like Hurry, but still pretty consistently solid. Hell, I'd probably come back to this more than I would come back to Yay, so for me, strong 6 out of 10. Check it out if you're curious. Next up, we have the newest album from the Hunna, Dare. So I've talked about silent majority acts who tend to build up big audiences who aren't really active in music but are still faced with critical indifference or derision, but they can really be split into 2 categories. When they're blandly competent enough to get something of a free pass, and those who are so insufferably boring that critics who have heard a wider selection of music pan them, while their audience just winds up confused about some of the backlash. And the Hunna, they definitely fall into the latter category with me. I did not review their overlong, underwritten slog of a debut 2 years ago, and this record is only an improvement because it's shorter. Critics tend to go on about this band usually go for the utterly boring lyrics first, cliched and utterly forgettable for any unique turn of phrase, but when you pair it with a frontman with no tangible grit or presence, and some of the muddiest mixing I have heard in mainstream rock, which totally neuters any decent guitar texture you might get on the verses, when you then just wash it out for the hook, you just get some premium grade tedium. What blows my mind is that the Hunna are signed to 300, a label primarily known for hip-hop acts, but they've co-opted so little of the style or flair of their label mates for the sort of sanitized pablum that even a lot of rock radio would ignore. If I were to give them credit for anything, it would come into the hints of tremolo riffing to flesh out any sort of melody, and they've got a little bit more texture in their guitar riffs this time around, but it's often so drained of presence and undercooked for melodies that they barely modulate or show any sort of real spark. Hell, when they do get a little bit of color out of this reverb saturated drippy mix, there are some okay tunes here, but otherwise, I've been listening to this album for the past month, and I don't think I can remember a single track from it. Light 5 out of 10, I'd probably skip it. Next up, the newest project from the summer ends, Burden on Your Mind. So I've had artists become patrons so I can recover their newest projects when they vote them up, but I think this is the first time where a fair few members of the band became patrons specifically to vote this EP up my schedule. And given the person who recommended this initially, I did have some hopes this would turn out pretty well, even if by virtue of it being an EP, it was probably going to hit the trailing edge unless it absolutely blew me away. Sadly, it didn't quite blow me away. What it reminds me of are the pop-punk acts of the late 2000s and early 2010s, pushing their pickups into slightly more synthetic, gummy, processed territory and adding a bunch of unnecessary gloss. And nowhere is that more evidence than in the production, where the shifts in volume leveling going into the hooks can feel incredibly slapdash and obvious, and the blend of their instrumentation really does a disservice to the sharper elements, especially the drums and the guitar solos. And the fact that the production feels so sloppy and synthetic is a damn shame, because at the core, this is a pretty decent band starting off. The lead guitar melodies are pretty creative for this brand of pop punk. The overdub vocals, they don't have much edge, but they kind of work for the above average slice of modern teen frustration we get in the lyrics, and they've got some decent enough hooks behind them. So yeah, it's not a bad EP and a band with some real promise, and I hope they've got the confidence to not rely on blatantly inorganic elements that don't complement their core sound, which unfortunately hurt this EP, but it's alright. Check it out if you're curious. Strong 6 out of 10. Next up, the newest project from Underoath, Erase Me. Alright, look, this has been on my schedule for a while now, and I really wanted to do my due diligence with this one, so I got my colleagues on YouTube as fellow critics who are bigger fans of this band to point me in the direction of the good stuff, which I listened to before giving this my full attention. And look, at this point, this band's just not for me. Again, some of this comes from my limited tolerance for post-hardcore screamo cliches, especially the 2000s, and when you factor in some painfully on-the-nose Christian lyrics, even the album cited as their best, the most I'd call them is okay or listenable. Not terrible, but not anything I would seek out either. And with Erase Me, sadly, not much has changed. Sure, there's less outright screaming in favor of more ferocious and potent howls, and I did appreciate Underoath stepping into slightly more experimental territory of openly questioning their faith. This is clearly a darker record than you would expect from them knowing their past, but it's a shame they did so in the most painfully melodramatic way possible that surrenders nuance for bellicose, overwrought posturing. And you know what? Even that could work in this genre. When the frontman talks about his struggles with addiction and Christian hypocrisy on that front, that's when this album actually gets some genuine edge and teeth, if the production didn't throw up over itself with a bunch of tinny, buzzing effects that only tested my patience further, and shows how this band has never faced an ugly bit of overproduction that they would not bring on board. Some critics have also drawn the comparison to recent Bring Me the Horizon albums, and I guess I can hear it in some of the gleaming background guitar texture tones, but that's peripheral to the unique problems that Underoath have already had, like the blocky programmed percussion, the grainy film swallowing potentially interesting melodies and drum work, really overproduced vocals, and writing that just did not have enough to really suck me in here. Again, if this is the darker push that fans have been looking for, the more mature Underoath, go for it, have fun. But for me, 5 out of 10, not really my thing. Next up, the newest EP from Jay Park, Ask About Me.
Just to watch you flaunt it. You're so pleasing to the eye, I'm just being honest. For you, I'm no nigga broke, empty out my pockets. I be like, you're my dope, so high, baby, work, girl, work like Rihanna, girl, you know I don't ever lie. This is a song I wrote just for my baby.
So alright, Korean-American hip-hop R&B artist who was originally a part of the idol group 2PM before going solo and churning out a fair number of well-received projects in between, taking an impressive amount of control of his career in K-pop, as well as racking up a bunch of acting credits. Good for him. In other words, I'm not entirely surprised to see his newest EP pop up on my schedule, especially considering that he popped up on Charlie XCX's Pop 2, which I covered for my 5th anniversary. And I'll freely admit that cut was what got me interested in this at all, because Jay Park's work outside of Pop 2 has had an unfortunate habit of following a lot of trends in pop and hip-hop, leaning really heavily on Jay Park's natural charisma to excuse some slapdash writing and, let's be polite and call it some unfortunate production in between the smoother and more conventional K-pop R&B cuts. Now with this EP, well, it's very much the modern version of that in 2018. Very conventional, synth-heavy, damp trap production that doesn't really do much to stand out for Jay Park, to either croon through Travis Scott's auto-tune or spit bars that sadly do not feel as well structured as they really should to earn that level of bravado, especially with how many rhymes just get flubbed. And yes, I am going to call that out here, especially considering nearly all the project is in English, along with guest verses from 2 Chainz clearly not giving a damn, Rich the Kid continuing not to impress, and Vic Mensa, man, it's the best verse on the project, but it's clear from every bar he can do better than this. And it's not like the content is all that special here either. It's by the numbers brag rap broken up by Jay Park, throwing in references to him being Asian, and even a song where he emphasizes how sexy he'll be even when he gets older. Alright, okay. So I guess if you want trap-flavored modern brag rap with a slick K-pop R&B gloss, it's worth a listen, but I can't promise it'll stick with you. Strong 5 out of 10, check it out if you're curious, but didn't do a lot for me. Next up, the newest project from Amen Dunes, Freedom.
Coasting all day, the way you going, we know what you say.
So this is one of those critically acclaimed projects that I got curious about when I started seeing critics I otherwise respected heralding this as one of the best of the year. Something that kind of flummoxed me given that I'd found their previous efforts reverb saturated and lacking the frontman or stable melodic composition in order to transcend that. Yeah, some people might find David McMahon's nasal warble appealing, but for as often as the group seemed to slip off the groove, the most I got from them was a poor man's war on drugs crossed with ramshackle traces of Mac DeMarco or Edward Sharpe. Now, to his credit, Damon McMahon, this is probably the most stable of his releases thus far, leaning into the smoother, mid to late 80s Americana-inflected atmospherics, and more textured if watery grooves that are clearly borrowing from U2 that can build some effective atmosphere. And that's honestly about all it does for me. Part of this is how I'm still not all that impressed at all by McMahon's drawling warble that seems to be leaning into a half-drunk nasal slur on this album. That's not quite as compelling as he tries to sell it. Part of it is the bleary-eyed atmospherics don't quite pick up the shimmering presence and wonder off of some admittedly catchy guitar lines, even if it is intended as more of a meditative mantra with grooves that are entirely too stiff, letting the concerns of our current life drift into a haze of half-formed transcendence or something. And yet, you know what? It's the details around the edges that triggers that desire for escape that actually gets pretty interesting for me. Complicated relationships with damaged father figures, pain that bleeds away within the passage of time, drug abuse, cause duh, and distinctly masculine myth-making, the sort of deconstruction of such that I honestly wish I could get into more. There's some fascinating stuff going on in the margins. Look, I definitely get the critical acclaim, but for me at least, nah, it's not getting there. I'll stick with the war on drugs. Still good though, so light 7 out of 10. If you're curious, check it out. Next up, the newest album from Journal, Chrysalis Ordialis.
My mind's at peace, is a rarity. No relief is mine to defend.
So in my reviews of Between the Buried and Me and Rollo Tomasi, I mentioned that when it comes to highly technical mathcore, post-hardcore prog metal, there's a way of listening to it where you can pick up on patterns and off-kilter hooks. Now, a trained ear can distinguish this material from the stuff where the sheer mind-boggling complexity just turns into instrumental wank. And while I didn't have a clear example of that material before, I certainly do now with Journal, the sort of mathcore, post-hardcore where the guitar work and the drums and the ferocious vocals are outright bonkers in terms of complexity, but finding an actual cohesive song structure can feel like an exercise in futility. Sure, there are a few passages where you can find something close to a pattern or a workable cadence to go back to, but you won't be able to appreciate them because there's nothing close to a hook before all the pieces catapult to a half dozen different discordant ideas smashed together. Yes, you do get some slower or cleaner passages that are a little bit easier to digest or maybe even like, but the transitions to get there often feel really slapdash and don't allow you to appreciate them. And again, in the playing might be impressive in terms of speed and technical skill, but without effective crescendo points or melodic climaxes, the dynamics feel really underserved and the impact of all that frenetic playing gets really diminished without contrast. Not helped by production that doesn't know how to build a significant groove and drum production that can feel oddly flat and really tinny, especially with their kick drums. Now, thankfully, Journal did package their lyrics into this hour-long exercise in migraines along with the album, and there does seem to be something of a narrative, but for as romantic as the language seems to be, although again, the free verse doesn't have any claim to structure whatsoever, there is something kind of dicey about masking some of the lightly toxic framing of the women on this album with this high-concept language, which reads like an overwritten modern video game cutscene threw up over a poetry compendium for your average tabletop RPG. Maidens and waifs of capricious nature that need to be saved, and that saving seems to imply a lot of murder from a protagonist that I'd like to hope the scattershot framing implies is kind of losing his mind in high concept wank. It might fit the delivery and presentation, but it really does feel pretentious and not in a good way. Again, there is an audience for this sort of pileup of sound, and you know what? You can have it, but even by that standard, it feels disjointed, overcooked, and not nearly as deep or compelling as it thinks it is. Again, not for me, so it's a very light 5 out of 10, but again, I'm not going back to this. And finally, the second album from Culture Delete, In the Land of the Dead. We started things off with Culture Delete, and now we're ending it with the other project they released that same day. About 90 minutes of experimental music. Fun stuff. And yeah, if I said that Suck the Internet was not for everybody, In the Land of the Dead is even more in that category. Spanning twisted, grainy noise clipping and contorting across the mix the cloudy ambient passages comfortably over the 20-minute mark, with synth tones that I would swear came from some of the late 80s or early 90s, all the way to extremely lo-fi sampling and a sung acoustic passage that barely fits within its own song, let alone the rest of the project. And as such, finding any more direct thematic arc within this album seems to be an exercise in futility again. If Suck the Internet was burning down that world, then The Land of the Dead is just wandering amidst some of the wreckage, trying to tune into whatever's left behind. And when this record leans into that sense of atmospheric emptiness, like on the two ambient adjacent cuts that all go really long, I would say it actually picks up a little bit of impact, especially with that gorgeous outro on Bright Lights Through an Ocean of Shimmer that comes right out of nowhere, but was definitely welcome, really sounded good. But the rest, though... Look, I get dramatic clash has always been a part of the aesthetic of this collection, especially coming off of Suck the Internet, but here it feels all the more out of place, like following all those spacey guitars on circles within circles, all the layers of snapping and flipping through papers, especially when just the ambient pieces, they sound fine on their own, they don't need that. And it's not like I don't get the crazy distorted critique of the faith-for-profit industry on the sermon, but I remind a little bit of the analogous environmental statements that The Knife made on Shaking the Habitual that could feel very one note and on the nose of their production samples as metaphor. It just really felt a little too heavy-handed for me. Hell, you know what? Shaking the Habitual, not a bad comparison. So if you want a more expansive, ambient, lo-fi, and obtuse version of that record with more rough edges, yeah, give this a shot. Light 6 out of 10, have fun with it. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. I can't really say I would seriously recommend much of what I went through today, but hey, if you're curious, links down there below. And if there's anything else I might be able to do to improve my presentation, I'm all ears. And if you guys want to get involved in my scheduling process so I can put more albums like this on the trailing edge, link to my Patreon right over there, where 3 times a week you guys get to vote on my schedule, and once a week for the higher tier contributors, you guys get to add albums, movies, or even a top 10 list to that schedule. More details right over there, and if you want to actually check out my schedule, it's on my Instagram, link down there below. But till then, I'm Mark, you're watching Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.